This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitzahon, and today I'm continuing with Core Set 2021 Limited Review Week. A Limited Review Week includes me talking about all the cards in the set individually, an archetype guide, and a top 10 on the biggest bombs in the format. So far, I've looked at all the white and blue cards in this set, and I'll be looking at black today. A few disclaimers before we proceed. These ratings are, of course, based on my opinion before actually playing with the cards, so I will definitely get some things wrong. Also, just to restate it, because it always comes up in the comments, the video is only about Limited. That means draft and sealed. I'm not talking about any other formats. Finally, I use a letter grade system to sum up how I feel about particular cards, and if you aren't familiar with what those letter grades mean, you can find an explanation of the grades in the comments. Alright, let's get started with our first black card. First, it's Alchemist's Gift, which for 1 black mana is a common instant, and it says target creature gets +1/+1 and gains your choice of Death Touch or a lifelink until end of turn. This is a nice trick. I'm usually on board with playing 1 mana +1/+1 Death Touch tricks anyway, since they're pretty good at helping a wide variety of creatures win combat. Having the lifelink option is nice here too, since the black-white deck in this format is all about gaining life, and sometimes you need some life to make it so your opponent can't race you anyway. It is still a trick, and those are inherently situational and risky, but this one is efficient and flexible, and that seems like a solid common to me. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Archfiends Vessel, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 human cleric at uncommon. It's got lifelink, and when it enters the battlefield, if it entered from your graveyard or you cast it from your graveyard, exile it. If you do, create a 5/5 black demon creature token with flying. This is a really cool design. It has some real potential in constructed, but it seems like it will be too hard to make work in Limited. The blue-black deck is about the graveyard and does have some ways to reanimate, so it isn't straight up impossible, just hard to pull off consistently. A 1 mana 1/1 with lifelink is generally not going to be worth playing in most decks because it's quickly outclassed in most games, so it has a very bad floor. This format does have a life gain archetype, so its ability to gain you life does matter a little, but you will need to have at least a couple of ways of getting this into play from your graveyard for it to be worth it. This is possible in the format, but not easy. For that reason, I think it's just a D. Next, it's Bad Deal, which for 4 generic and 2 black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says you draw 2 cards and each opponent discards 2 cards. Each player loses 2 life. The design here is nice. 6 mana to potentially get a 4-for-1 certainly intrigues me, but we do have to look at this realistically. A lot of the time, by the time you cast this, your opponent won't have much in their hand anyway, so it does have diminishing returns in a lot of games. That said, the fact that this isn't just a discard spell, and instead does something all game long, which is draw you 2 cards and do 2 damage to you and your opponent, being able to do that all game long is nice. One of the things that makes discard spells bad in Limited is that they're not relevant all game long, but Bad Deal will at least always do something. And when you do actually get your opponent with it, it will be absolutely backbreaking, but don't count on it always happening in that optimal way. Still, I think most slower black decks will want the first copy of this and should value it relatively highly. I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Blood Glutton, which for 4 generic and a black is a 4/3 vampire at common with lifelink. This is not a very efficient creature. Your opponent can trade down with it pretty easily. It is going to gain you at least 4 life, most of the time though, assuming it dies in combat, and that helps, especially with a bunch of cards in this set that check to see if you've gained 3 life or more on a given turn. I think that makes this card a card you'll play if you're in the life gain deck, but you probably don't play it otherwise. It feels weird to go with a build-around grade here because the difference between the two isn't huge, and it's not actually a build-around in and of itself, but I think the fact that you only want to play it in the life gain deck does mean I should do it. So I'm going to say it's a D+ in most black decks and a C in a life gain deck. Next, it's Caged Zombie, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 zombie at common. You can pay 1 generic and a black to tap it, and each opponent loses 2 life. Activate this ability only if a creature died this turn. So the black-green archetype is all about morbid, that is, cards being better if something died on a given turn, and that is what this is a payoff for. On a related note, black-red is about sacrificing creatures, and obviously that synergizes well with this too. A 3-mana 2/3 isn't great and usually not worth playing on its own, but the threat this presents to your opponent's life is very real, and this seems like some nice reach to have around. Creatures tend to just die in Magic, even if you're not trying to make it happen, so he will be able to do this more often than it may seem initially. That said, be ready to sometimes have his ability become available when you just don't have the mana available for it. It seems like he will be a great late game threat more than anything, when you're more likely to have that mana available. Early, he's really not that great. I think this seems like a solid common. I'm giving him a C. Next, it's Carrion Grub, which for 3 generic and a black is a 0/5 insect at uncommon, and he gets +X/+0, where X is the greatest power among creature cards in your graveyard, and when it enters the battlefield, you mill 4 cards. So how high does the power need to be here for you to feel like you're doing alright? Well, honestly, a 4-mana 2/5 is a decent enough deal, especially when it mills you 4 cards and enables graveyard strategies like this can, and I think most of the time you won't have a problem getting this to be a 2/5, and it'll often be larger. It doesn't have evasion or anything, but the self-mill and good blocker, which can later potentially become a better attacker, is pretty nice. I like that they decided to let its power continue to change while it's in play, instead of simply having it check what the highest power is when it comes down. This may have some potential combat trick-esque effect, say, if you sacrifice a creature or discard a card or mill yourself at instant speed and suddenly bump its power up. Obviously, you won't always have control over what gets milled, but it is something to keep in mind. I feel like this is close to getting to a B-, but I don't quite think I want to first pick it. I'm going to start this at a C+. Next up, it's Crypt Lurker, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/4 horror at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a creature or discard a creature card. If you do, draw a card. This is a 4-mana 3/4 with some decent utility, letting you cash in a creature to draw a card. In a pinch, keep in mind the Lurker can even sacrifice itself. This format has a few sacrifice payoffs, especially in black-red, so this will be extra good there. You can also discard a creature card with it, which will generally be less ideal, but the blue-black deck does have ways of reanimating creatures, so maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing ever. The base stats it has are pretty mediocre, and its upside isn't that impressive either, so I think this will end up getting axed a lot of the time. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, we have Deathbloom Thallid, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 fungus at common, and when it dies, you make a 1/1 sapperling creature token. This is a nice reprint. A 3-mana 3/2 that leaves a 1/1 behind when it dies is always nice and limited, as it lets you trade for things and still leave some value behind. This gets extra useful in a deck with ways of sacrificing stuff, since the Thallid gives you 2 bodies to sacrifice with only 1 card. I feel like the last time we saw this, I was probably a little too high on it, which is weird for me. Usually I underrate things and I don't overrate them. I think last time I gave it a B-, but in reality, it's probably more like a C+. Next up, it's Demonic Embrace, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a rare aura. It's got Enchant Creature. Enchanted Creature gets +3/+1, has flying, and is a demon in addition to its other types. And you may cast Demonic Embrace from your graveyard by paying 3 life and discarding a card, in addition to paying its other costs. If you've been with me for a set review before or watched my draft videos, you know that I'm not a huge fan of the majority of auras because they open you up to a 2-for-1, and many auras aren't worth that risk. Demonic Embrace is one of those auras that can get around that problem for the most part. This is because you can cast it from your graveyard, and the bonus it gives is pretty serious for 3 mana. +3/+1 in flying will make almost any creature into a threat, and even if your opponent kills that creature, you have Demonic Embrace ready to come back from your graveyard and make another creature into a threat. The cost of bringing the Embrace back is certainly real. 3 life and a card does mean that you're not really getting around the 2-for-1 straight up, but its recursion and its efficiency makes it worth doing because the bonus here is so impressive. I think you first pick this a lot of the time. I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Duress, which for 1 black mana is a common sorcery, and it says target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-creature, non-land card from it. That player discards that card. We've seen Duress a lot, and like usual, you don't want this in your main deck. It's an F if you do that. Creatures and lands are the most common card types in Limited, so Duress can whiff very easily. It is worth siding in against opponents who are spell heavy, and I think it's a C when you can do that. Next up, it's Eliminate, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon instant, and it says destroy target creature or planeswalker with converted mana cost 3 or less. This is nice removal. Sure, it can't kill everything, but it does the job incredibly efficiently, and most decks are going to have plenty of targets for this. We see cards like this a lot, and they are always worth taking highly because of their efficiency. Being instant speed is great too, as that can really allow you to manufacture some very real blowouts, and you will frequently be paying 2 mana to kill something that costs 3, and that's some real tempo. I think you can first pick this pretty confidently. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Fetid Imp, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/2 imp at common. It's got flying, and you can pay 1 black mana to give it death touch until end of turn. We've seen him before, and he was a nice little guy last time. Having the ability to attack in the air in the early game, and then trade for anything in the late game is pretty nice. Most death touch creatures don't come with flying, but this can even take down some big aerial creatures with that death touch, and that's nice to be able to do. This is a solid 2-drop for black decks. I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Finishing Blow, which for 4 generic and a black is a common instant, and it says destroy target creature or planeswalker. This is nice. 5 mana to kill a creature or walker at instant speed is a very serviceable removal spell. I do think costing 5 makes it pretty hard for something that just trades 1 for 1 to be premium, though. It being an instant does mean sometimes it will do more than the 1 for 1 thing, but still. I think you run these, but there is definitely better removal in black in this set, and you kind of hope you get those instead. You probably never cut the first copy, but running more than 1 doesn't seem super ideal to me. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Gloom Sower, which for 5 generic and 2 black is an 8/6 horror at common, and when it becomes blocked by a creature, that creature's controller loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. I'm not that into this. A 7 mana 8/6 with absolutely no evasion is pretty ugly, even if it does drain the opponent 2 life when it gets blocked. This does mean, by the way, that if multiple creatures block it, 2 life is drained for each one, and of course the black-white deck can take advantage of gaining life, but still. This thing doesn't seem like what I'll usually want to be doing. It's just so big and clunky. I think it's a D+. Next, it's Gourmand, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a 5/5 demon at uncommon. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature. It's got flying, it's got trample, and when it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a creature. The design here is cool. He's kind of like a gigantic fleshbag marauder or merciless executioner, and that seems pretty good to me. The name here is pretty hilarious too. When I first saw it, I assumed it was a joke name that Scryfall assigned to it, but the play on words is pretty hilarious. Anyway, sure, you have to have a creature in play to sacrifice to be able to play him in the first place, and you won't always have the ideal creatures to give up for it, but a 5/5 flyer, and trampler, can end games, especially one that makes your opponent lose a creature too. It will be hard for you to not come out ahead. You theoretically drastically upgrade your worst creature while they lose a creature on their board and don't replace it. The setup here is real, but black-red is about sacrificing, so it can even get a little extra value out of this. So it has a setup, but not a super crazy one, and you get a very nice body while taking away from the opponent's board. I think that's enough for this to be first pickable. I'm giving him a B-. Next, it's Grasp of Darkness, which for 2 black mana is a common instant, and it says target creature gets -4/-4 until end of turn. Last time we saw this, it was uncommon, and it felt right at uncommon because it's such a strong removal spell. That means it's going to be a really amazing common here. 2 mana for -4/-4 at instant speed is an amazing rate. It can outright kill X4s, which will generally cost more than 2 mana, and it can even be used to help take down larger creatures in combat. You're going to first pick this over most of the cards in this set. It might be black's best common. It probably is, actually. Giving it a B. Next up, it's Grim Tutor, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a mythic rare sorcery, and it says search your library for a card, put that card into your hand, then shuffle your library. You lose 3 life. This set has some awesome reprints for the EDH crowd, but most of the cards they reprinted with that audience in mind also aren't very good in limited. Grim Tutor is great in a 99-card singleton format where you get to build your deck out of any and all the cards ever, since it will be netting you a powerful card or one that is great in a given situation. In limited, Grim Tutor's functionality is nowhere near as high. Sure, you can get that removal spell you need or find a bomb, but paying 3 mana and 3 life for that isn't a great deal, especially because for many cards you search up, you won't be able to cast them the turn you get them either. In many ways, this amounts to a 3 mana draw 1. It is admittedly a little better than that, but still, I only see myself playing this in a super controlling deck that is planning on winning with a big bomb, because in those situations you have a few targets that are at least intriguing, But even then, I'm not very interested in this. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Hooded Blight Fang, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/4 snake at rare with Death Touch. And whenever a creature you control with Death Touch attacks, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And whenever a creature you control with Death Touch deals damage to a planeswalker, destroy that planeswalker. They have been pushing these keyword lord type creatures a lot lately, which sort of makes sense. It's design space they have surprisingly done little with so far. Anyway, a 3-mana 1/4 with Death Touch is probably a C or a C+. Being able to block and survive against so many big creatures is great, and with Death Touch around, the best your opponent will be able to do is trade. The Blight Fang, though, can actually be aggressive as far as 1/4s go, because it drains 1 life when it attacks, meaning it threatens 2 damage anytime it attacks while gaining you 1 life, and a 1/4 Death Touch isn't something that is easy to block on many board states. The Planeswalker aspect will come up some, but only very rarely. Obviously, the more Death Touch creatures you have, the better, but even on its own, Blight Fang is a good card defensively and offensively, and I think it does enough to get into the lower range of first pickable, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Infernal Scarring, which for 1 generic and a black is a common aura with enchant creature, and enchanted creature gets +2/+0 and has, when this creature dies, draw a card. This is an okay-ish aura that we've seen before. It does give you a card back if your creature dies, which prevents the 2-for-1, but the bonus it gives is not the most impressive for the investment. And you can still get 2-for-1 if your opponent uses removal in response. It goes best on flyers, but black doesn't have a huge number of those to go around. I don't think you play this most of the time. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Kerr Veck, the Spiteful, who for 2 generic and 2 black is a 3/2 human warlock at rare, and he has a static ability that simply says, other creatures get -1/-1. This version of Kerr Veck is interesting. So, because his effect is symmetrical, you don't really want to be playing him in a deck with lots of X1s, or even a deck that is very creature heavy. If you do, you're just playing a 4-mana 2/3 that will often have more downside than upside, and that's not really what you want. However, should you end up in a black-based deck that runs only a few creatures, that's where this might be worth running. -1/-1 to the whole board is no joke, and really makes it challenging for opponents to find a way to do lethal to you before you win the game with a grindy control deck. Problem is, ending up with a deck like that is not always easy, so I think most of the time you just don't want Kerr Veck in your limited deck. Consider bringing him in out of the sideboard against someone with lots of X1s, but for now I'm going to say he's a D in your main deck, and maybe a C in a deck that can really utilize him, or a deck that brings him out of the sideboard. Next up, it's Kite Freebooter, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/2 human pirated uncommon. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-creature, non-land card from it, exile that card until Kite Freebooter leaves the battlefield. This is a very nice reprint. I'm usually a pretty big fan of ravenous rats type creatures, and this is one of the best iterations of that we've ever seen. You get a 1/2 flyer who really disrupts the opponent's plan, and flying really means that it can do some work in the skies in the early game too. Sometimes people get hung up on the fact that Kite Freebooter gives the card back to the opponent when the Freebooter dies, and that certainly isn't quite as good as making them discard most of the time, but the fact that you get to choose what they lose is great. Even if they do kill it a few turns later, the amount of disruption the Freebooter has provided by that point will more than make it worth it. There's a reason this guy is played in Modern, and he's great in Limited too. Good enough that I think taking him with the first pick is correct sometimes, giving him a B-. Next up, it's Liliana, Waker of the Dead, who for 2 generic and 2 black is a legendary Planeswalker Liliana at Mythic Rare. She starts with 4 loyalty. Her +1 says each player discards a card, each opponent who can't loses 3 life. Her -3 says target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is the number of cards in your graveyard. And her -7 says you get an emblem with, at the beginning of combat on your turn, put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It gains haste. Her +1 is nice because it takes cards away from both you and the opponent, but eventually it starts damaging your opponent if they don't have something to discard. The fact that you have to discard actually ultimately synergizes well with her -3, which is a nice effect if you can get some cards in your graveyard. Cards in your graveyard will happen organically, of course, but there will undoubtedly be times where she comes down and the best you can do with her is give -1/-1 to something, which will be pretty bad, especially as you lower her loyalty to 1. Her ultimate is also incredibly powerful and also synergizes with her +1 quite well. It is definitely the kind of ultimate that can end games, and it is great you reap the rewards right away. Not only does the creature reanimate when you go to combat, it has haste so you can send it in right away if you need to. So I think the whole package here is a very good card for limited, but she isn't a bomb planeswalker. Those are the kinds that can actively protect themselves and have removal effects that take a lot less effort than Liliana. Still, you probably take her over most of the cards in this format. I'm giving her a B. Next up, it's Liliana's Devotee, who for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 human warlock at uncommon. Zombies you control get +1/+0, and at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you may pay 1 generic and a black. If you do, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. So there are enough zombies in this set that a 3-mana 2/3 that gives +1/+0 to your zombies is probably worth playing already. But I think what makes this card extra good is the ability to make a zombie token at the end of your turn if a creature died. Obviously, it will be a 3/2 zombie as long as the Devotee is around. Paying 2 mana just won't be possible sometimes though, but it is the kind of thing that can really torment your opponent late, since you will be able to attack aggressively and trade, and then get a zombie at the end of your turn. I think the reasonable floor here, coupled with a fairly powerful ability, makes Devotee a card that I want to be taking with the first pick sometimes. It also synergizes well with the black-red Sacrifice deck and the black-green Morbid deck, and that's nice. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Lilianas Standardbearer, who for 2 generic and a black is a 3/1 zombie knight at rare. It has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, draw X cards, where X is the number of creatures that died under your control this turn. I like this card a lot. A 3-mana 3/1 with flash is probably a C- or so on its own, since it can flash in and trade for X3s in combat, but that usually won't be what you want to do with this. Ideally, you want to trade for some of your opponent's stuff when they attack you, or when you attack them, and then flash this guy in to draw a few cards. Even if you're only drawing 1 card off of this, and you're like trading with the bearer himself, you're in business. Anything more than that, and it just gets silly. Now, it will be tricky to find a way where you can both flash him in and draw cards and then use him to block, because generally you're going to have to play him at the end of your opponent's turn after combat has happened, because that's likely when creatures will have died, so keep that in mind. He does have the potential of just being something you can flash in desperation, and that doesn't hurt. While this does require some setup, it isn't exactly far-fetched to have a creature or 2 die to enable this. I think the card advantage this can give you is impressive and makes it worth taking most of the time when you see it. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Lilianas Steward, which for 1 black mana is a 1/2 zombie at common, and you can tap it and sacrifice it, and target opponent discards a card. Activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. I like the first 3 Liliana cards a lot, but I don't like this one very much. Sure, it's a 1-drop that can kind of stay relevant all game, but its relevance is basically always very small. A 1-mana 1/2 is quickly outclassed and limited, and giving this up to make your opponent discard a card of their choice doesn't seem great to me either. It does enable the morbid effects some of your creatures have in the black-green deck, and it sacrifices, so that matters in the black-red deck. Still, I think I'm going to avoid playing this most of the time. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Malefic Scithe, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon artifact equipment. It enters the battlefield with a soul counter on it. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each soul counter on Malefic Scithe, and whenever equipped creature dies, put a soul counter on Malefic Scithe. It has an equip cost of 1. So we've seen equipment kind of like this before, like Banshee's Blade, and in the past it hasn't been costed so that it is actually worth playing. I think they changed that here. A 2-mana equipment that costs 1 to equip and gives +1/+1 would be a card that is either a D+ or a C-. Not great, but playable. This has more upside than that, as it can progressively grow throughout the game, and I think that additional upside is enough to make this a pretty nice piece of equipment for limited. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Masked Blackguard, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/1 human rogue at common. It's got flash, and you can pay 2 generic and a black to give it +1/+1 until end of turn. A 2-mana 2/1 with flash is probably a D+ or so. It can flash in and trade for more expensive things sometimes, but obviously it isn't much of a blocker. The Blackguard does come with the additional ability to pump its stats, something that can be pretty nice in the late game, but it does do it incredibly inefficiently. Still, it's a 2-drop that maintains some relevance even in the late game, and I don't hate that. But I think most of the time, you're kind of hoping you have a better 2-drop than this, giving him a C-. Next up, it's Massacre Worm, which for 3 generic and 3 black is a 6/5 worm at Mythic Rare. When it enters the battlefield, creatures your opponents control get -2/-2 until end of turn, and whenever a creature an opponent control dies, that player loses 2 life. This is a powerful reprint. It was a bomb last time, and it will be this time too. A 6 mana 6/5 that gives -2/-2 to your opponent's board is very powerful. Obviously, this can kill X2s outright, but you can also set up situations where he comes down and kills bigger things too if you attack your opponent and they block. The life loss is no joke either, and as the name implies, this can really massacre the board and your opponent in many scenarios. You can also play it in your first main phase to enable attacks, and then force your opponent into ugly blocks that they have to do to survive while they still lose life. Sometimes it will just be a 6/5, but that won't happen very often, and as far as fail cases go, could be a lot worse. I think you're going to first pick this every time you open it. I'm giving it an A. Next, it's Mind Rot, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says target player discards 2 cards. This is a core set classic, and it's always pretty mediocre. It is, of course, quite nice when you can get a 2-for-1 out of it, but you're not always going to be able to do that. As the game goes on, it frequently becomes more useless, and it doesn't impact the board itself at all. This is a card you'll play if you're desperate for playables, but you'll hope to cut it most of the time. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, we have Necromentia, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a rare sorcery, and it says choose a card name other than a basic land card name. Search target opponent's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with that name and exile them. That player shuffles their library, then creates a 2/2 black zombie creature token for each card exiled from their hand this way. So, when I first saw this card, I misread it and thought we finally had a version of Cranial Extraction that impacts the board. Giving you a 2/2 zombie if you get a card from their hand would have been interesting, but that's not what we have here. Instead, it gives your opponent a zombie if you name a card in their hand. This type of card is always bad and limited because, firstly, it doesn't impact the board at all, and second, it is difficult to know what to name in limited, especially in best of 1, and third, even if you do hit something with it, you have to think how likely it was your opponent would have drawn the card anyway, and in most cases, it isn't that likely. You're not having a real impact on the game most of the time, you're basically just mulliganing and paying 3 mana to do it, so don't do it. This is an F. Next up, it's Peer into the Abyss, which for 4 generic and 3 black is a rare sorcery, and it says target player draws cards equal to half the number of cards in their library and loses half their life. Round up each time. Well, this is pretty wacky and definitely a greatness at any cost card for black decks, so a lot of the time this will help you reload your hand. And not only that, but you'll end up with some insane card selection, keeping whatever cards are the best in the top half of your deck. Keep in mind, if you're spending the 7 on this, you probably aren't doing anything else on your turn, so you won't get to hold on to all of those cards. You'll have to discard down to 7. The fact that this doesn't do anything to change the board is a big concern, as if you're behind, you're just going to end up even further behind after you cast this. Sure, if you get to untap, you're going to be okay, but it will be hard to find the time to cast this. And don't forget, you're also lowering your life while you're at it. You can also use this on your opponent in a situation where it either gets them kind of close to being milled out if you're interested in doing that, or it lowers their life enough that you can now do lethal. This is a weird one to judge, as I can see most controlling black decks running one of these for the extreme late game, but I also don't think you really want to be going after it remotely early since it's such a dead card until that part of the game. I think this really just ends up being a C. You will win games when you get to cast it and untap, but counting on those things is a bad idea. Next, it's Pestilent Haze, which for 1 generic and 2 black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says choose one. All creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn, or remove 2 loyalty counters from each planeswalker. This kind of card is usually not that good and limited. It's hard to find situations where it works. You need to impact your opponent's side of the board more, or it isn't worth it. And while the loyalty counters thing is nice additional upside, it won't come up much in limited. Basically, I think this is just a C. You'll play it in a control deck, and some opponents will be devastated by it, but finding the situation where it lines up just right isn't that easy. Next up, it's Rise Again, which for 4 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Well, 5 mana to reanimate is not a spectacular deal, but the blue-black deck looks to be pretty good at loading the graveyard, making this seem at least somewhat serviceable in that deck. You have to hope what you're getting back is actually worth 5 mana, and that just isn't always possible, but still, this seems like a fine playable. You can also reanimate Archfiends Vessel and turn it into that 5/5 demon, which is pretty cool. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Sanctum of Stone Fangs, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon legendary enchantment shrine. And it says at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of shrines you control. This is probably the best of the shrine cycle, either on its own or in a deck with multiple shrines. I'll talk more about that shrine deck and how it might work later this week in the archetype guide, but the Cliff's Note version is this. It will probably be a legit archetype in the format. Anyway, this compares pretty favorably with Ill-Gotten Inheritance, which we saw a few sets ago. 2 mana to drain your opponent 1 life every turn is a very real thing, and helps create a gap of 2 life between you and your opponent every turn, making it increasingly hard for your opponent to race as the game goes on. It doesn't have the late game activated ability that Inheritance did, but since it costs half the mana to cast in the first place, I think that's okay. I think even on its own, this shrine is a nice playable for black decks, which probably won't ever cut the first copy, especially if they're interested in gaining life. I'm giving it a C+ there. Then, in the Shrine deck, I think it will be the best win condition and is probably a B there. This means that of all the shrines, this is probably the one you might consider with the first pick because of the reasonable floor and high ceiling. Next up, it's Sanguine Indulgence, which for 3 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says this spell costs 3 less to cast if you've gained 3 or more life this turn, and return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. So, 4 mana to get 2 creatures back from the graveyard is a semi-reasonable card anyway, probably a C. It's the kind of effect that it's nice to have one of because in the late game it gives you the extra edge you need to grind out a win. This also has the life gain upside of sometimes only costing a single black mana, and if you can do that consistently, it will be extra silly. I think basically every black deck will seek out the first copy of this, and maybe the life gain decks will want even more than that, but that first copy should be taken pretty aggressively. Not super early or anything, but I'd value that first copy as a C+. Next, it's Silver Smote Ghoul, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon zombie vampire, and it says at the beginning of your end step, if you gain 3 or more life this turn, return Silver Smote Ghoul from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. You can also pay 1 generic and a black to sacrifice it and draw a card. A couple of days ago, we saw some nice life gain payoffs in white. We've also seen a few in this video, but this is probably the best black payoff for the life gain deck. A 3 mana 3/1 that can sacrifice itself to draw a card would probably be something like a C on its own, but the extra value you get out of this ghoul in a life gain deck is no joke. Gaining 3 life a turn is fairly attainable, and even just getting this guy back once is not going to be fun for your opponent, as it will usually represent a 2-for-1. Creatures who don't stay dead and just keep coming back and attacking or blocking, even if they are somewhat fragile like the ghoul, are excellent in limited, because card advantage really is king, and that's what he'll be generating for you. I really like that this has a reasonable floor and an impressive ceiling. It makes first picking it worth it. I'll give it a build-around grade. Let's say it's a C in your typical black deck and a B in a deck that really gets there on life gain. Next up, it's Skeleton Archer, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/3 Skeleton Archer at common, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to any target. This is a solid little common that we've seen before. A 4 mana 3/3 is not so good, but this is able to do 1 damage to anything, and it isn't that hard to manufacture turns where that lets you kill something. You can do it after combat to finish something off, or obviously kill an X1, and even in a complete fail case, he can shoot an arrow at the opponent, so that's pretty decent. He was a C last time, and I think he'll be one this time too. Next up, it's Tavern Swindler, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 human rogue at uncommon. You can tap it and pay 3 life, and you flip a coin, and if you win the flip, you gain 6 life. This is a wacky little 2 mana 2/2. The upside it offers is real, especially with all the cards that pay you off for gaining 3 or more life in a turn. And yeah, about half the time you'll just lose 3 life, but most of the time it will more than likely just even out, since you'll get the life back ultimately, and you will theoretically also be getting some triggers out of the ability. It is a reasonable playable in any black deck, since it's a 2 mana 2/2 with some upside, but it will certainly be at its best in a deck that cares about gaining life. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Thieves' Guild Enforcer, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 human rogue at rare. It's got flash, and whenever it or another rogue enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent mills 2 cards, and as long as an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, Thieves' Guild Enforcer gets +2/+1 and has Death Touch. This doesn't seem like it's going to be great in limited. There are other rogues in this set. but this will still just be a 1-mana 1/1 with flash a lot of the time, which I'm not interested in. That's not very good in the early game, and it will generally take until the late game for her to become relevant as a 3/2 with Death Touch, though a 3/2 with Death Touch for 1 mana with flash is pretty interesting, and for that reason, we can't dismiss the card entirely. I think that if you have a few other ways of getting cards in your opponent's graveyard, she is probably a C. Next up, it's Village Rites, which for 1 black mana is a common instant, and it says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards. I think it's fair to compare this to a red card like Tormenting Voice. Both cost you 2 cards to get you 2 cards, and yes, there are some differences. The right needs a creature in play, and it's an instant, but I think this will serve a similar purpose. If you have lots of creature tokens, or use it in response to removal, or sacrifice a creature shut down by an aura, it's going to feel pretty good, and if you have sacrifice synergies, it will be a little better too. But I think that it only makes the cut in your deck about half the time, kind of like Tormenting Voice, and usually it's just barely getting there as a 23rd or 24th card, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Veto, Thorn of the Dusk Rose, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/3 legendary vampire cleric at rare. It says whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life, and for 3 generic and 2 black, creatures you control gain lifelink until end of turn. So as we've said, the black-white color pair is about gaining life in this format, so Veto will have a very clear home there. Even without being in that deck though, Veto can make your creatures a huge problem for your opponent later in the game, since giving your whole team lifelink is no joke. There will certainly be board states when you have Veto down, and no matter how your opponent blocks, they're dead because of Veto's lifelink ability and his static ability combined. In the early game, he won't be doing a ton, outside of a deck with some other life gain going on, but still, he can represent some serious damage all on his own, and if you really manage to build a life gain deck, he will be truly oppressive. He's a bit vulnerable and needs some help in the early game to be a factor, but I think he does enough to be a card you want to first pick most of the time. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Walking Corpse, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 zombie at common. 2 mana 2/2s with no upside don't really get it done these days. You only play them if you're desperate for 2 drops, and that makes us a D. And our last black card is Witch's Cauldron, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon artifact, and you can pay 1 generic and a black and tap it and sacrifice a creature to gain 1 life and draw a card. This is a nice sacrifice outlet. Turning creatures into cards and life is pretty nice, and means that this has some extra usefulness in 3 different black archetypes. Black-red Sacrifice, Green-black Morbid, and Black-white Life Gain. Not all decks will have the fodder to sacrifice to this necessarily, but most of the time there will be expendable creatures you give up, especially if you have ways to gain extra value out of losing that creature. I think this is a useful enough card that most black decks, assuming they have 15 or more creatures, should probably seek out the first copy of this. I'm giving it a C+. Well, that does it for all the black cards in Core Set 2021. If you disagree with any of my evaluations, let me know in the comments. Discussion about these cards can only help us all be better at Magic. Tomorrow I'll be back to look at all the red cards in this set. By the way, my videos are of course sponsored by Card Kingdom, and you can pre-order Core Set 2021 now if you follow my referral link in the description, so go check that out. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you see the rest of the set review and a bunch more limited content, don't forget to subscribe. And if you need to see the other limited review videos for Core Set 2021, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.